Who took my slippers? Mama Bolan shouted, her voice ringing through the house. Everyone, come out here right now. Don't make me count to 3. Who's that fool shouting so early in the morning? Mr. Idaho grumbled, yawning as he stepped out of his room. Mrs. Solar, who was busy bathing her 2 daughters for school, quickly came out too, curiosity on her face. One by one, the tenants living in Mr. Fadde's house began to gather. In the center of the compound, their expressions a mix of irritation and concern. A few, however, chose to stay indoors, having long mastered the art of minding their own business, while others hurried off to work, unwilling to get caught up in the commotion. Mama Bolan, what is the problem this morning? Asked Chucks, whose real name was Chukwemeka. The others nodded, waiting for her to speak. I woke up to wear my slippers, Mama Bolan said, looking very angry. I always leave them outside my door, but now they are gone. Ah, everyone shouted at the same time. That's how I kept my daughter's school sandals outside too, another woman said. When I came out to get them, they were no longer there. This is too much, someone else added. Up to 15 pairs of slippers have been stolen already. Is the person selling them? Or what are they doing with all the slippers? They tried to figure out who was taking the slippers. The shouting filled the air, loud enough to wake even the deepest sleepers. But the thief who had been stealing slippers, sandals, and shoes seemed not to care about their cries and complaints. The tenants were sure the culprit lived among them, but they had no idea who it was, man or woman. They had held countless meetings to solve the mystery, but nothing came of it. Even after searching every room each time a theft occurred, they never found the stolen footwear. It was as if the thief had vanished into thin air. That morning, after the noise died down, everyone went about their daily business. But if the thief knew what was coming, they might have thought twice before stealing again. For a long time, many suspected Mr. Ojukwu, the tenant in the 7th room on the left side of the house as you enter. He sold and polished footwear, so people assumed he was stealing to sell. But when 2 pairs of shoes disappeared right from outside his door, they realized he wasn't the one. That morning, Mr. Ojukwu prepared to take some shoes to a customer. He stepped inside briefly to grab his store key, but when he came back out, the shoes he was about to deliver had vanished too. Frustrated and confused, he left for work, shaking his head at the mystery. After everyone had gone, the compound grew quiet again. Mama Bolan, whose slippers had been stolen earlier, sat outside the house, calmly sieving beans chaff. She was the wife of Baba Bolan, a tailor. Their 2 children were at school, and her husband had left for his shop. She worked patiently, her hands busy, but her mind replaying the strange events of the morning. Mama Bolan was a housewife, so no one expected her to work outside the home. She was humming a song when Mrs. Ifeanyi, the well-known gossip, sat next to her. Everyone in the big house knew that when Mrs. Ifeanyi came to talk to you, it was usually to gossip about something. Sometimes she was right, but most of the time, she was wrong. Her stories were often stretched and exaggerated. She had no job and was always idle. When she sat next to Mama Bolan, Mama Bolan knew something was coming. Mama Bolan, do you know I know who stole your slippers last night? Mrs. Ifeanyi asked. Oh, tell me who it is. Mama Bolan replied sarcastically. It's our landlord, Baba Fadar. You know he has a spare key to our building. He lives in a different house, but I know he comes into the main building at night and takes people's slippers. Mrs. Ifeanyi explained. When did you see him do that? What time? Mama Bolan asked, pretending to care. I saw him. Mrs. Ifeanyi started to explain, but Mama Bolan interrupted her. Mrs. Ifeanyi, Mama Bolan said, stretching her name. Don't you know that when you lie or gossip about things, no one will believe you when you tell the truth? Must you always gossip? At least find something to do instead of talking about people, Mama Bolan said. Our landlord is a good man, and he would never do that. You don't believe me now, but one day, you'll all accept what I say, Mrs. Ifeanyi replied. Can't you see that his slippers have never been stolen? That's because he lives in a different building. He doesn't live with us, Mama Bolan snapped. You're badmouthing the landlord, but that man helps you all the time. Do you think I don't know that your family owes more than a year's rent? And still, the landlord is kind and lenient with you? You must be wondering how I know that because you never stop talking about your family. Mrs. Ifeanyi fell silent, unable to reply after being insulted. She quietly walked away. As she left, Mama Bolan muttered under her breath, foolish woman. The next day, Tobi, the landlord's son, and his friend were talking loudly on the veranda of the big house. The friend was Segun, a young tenant around Tobi's age, who was into the Yahoo business. They were very close friends ever since Segun rented a room in the house. Segun was also a student at a famous university nearby. They were mischievous, always looking for trouble. Segun rarely went to class. Most of the time, they wandered around the community, causing mischief. Tobi was a secondary school graduate, but he didn't study for his exams. Because of that, he had failed the same exam 4 times. His father, Mr. Fadar, was very sad about it. As his only son, Mr. Fadar worried that Tobi would waste his money and properties. Tobi's mother, the landlord's wife, had died when Tobi was only 3 years old. Since then, Mr. Fadar had been raising him alone. Mr. Fadar also noticed that Tobi became worse when he started spending time with Segun. He tried his best to keep them apart, but their friendship grew even stronger. Mr. Fadar heard their loud voices from outside and came into the veranda. "You boy, haven't I told you not to hang out with Segun?" Mr. Fadar asked angrily. Tobi, sitting on a chair, muttered words his father couldn't understand, his face full of anger. Mr. Fadar grabbed his son's ear and marched him out of the house. As they left, Mr. Fadar turned back and warned Segun to stay away from his son. When they reached their building, Mr. Fadar sat Tobi down and began to speak to him, as he always did, with wise words. "Oluwatobi," he said, calling his son by his full name. "You may think I am a cruel father right now, but one day you will understand. Everything I am doing is for your own good. You are not a child anymore. I want you to be successful in life. Please listen to me so that you don't end up lost." "Are you even listening?" Mr. Fadar asked. "Daddy, I will do as you say," Tobi replied, his face expressionless. 2 weeks later, Tobi and Segun secretly met at a local restaurant to talk about something serious. They spoke in low, worried voices. Tobi broke the silence. "The herbalist told us that all the people whose slippers we've taken have no good destiny. He gave us 3 days to find a great person's slippers, or we would die," Tobi said, his voice full of worry. "Don't worry," Segun reassured him. "We will figure it out. There's no need to be scared. Just relax. Let's go see the herbalist and get the sleeping charm from him." Segun added, "Then we'll carry out the theft." They arrived at the herbalist's house. He greeted them and led them to his charm room. Once inside, the herbalist asked, "Have you two decided whose slippers you are going to steal tonight?" "No, Baba," Segun said. "We are still working on it." Tobi just nodded nervously. The herbalist looked at them seriously. "I've told you if your friend is scared of this, he can back out now." Segun quickly answered, "No, Baba. He's not scared." He turned to Tobi. "Are you scared?" he asked, turning to Tobi. No, I'm not," Tobi stammered, trying to sound confident but failing to hide the fear in his voice. "You boys better not make any mistakes this time," the herbalist warned. "The slippers, shoes and sandals you brought me before, either the owner has no glory, or they've been used, or they are protected by God, or the person doesn't have a long life, and so on. I don't know what you were thinking when you picked those pairs." The boys promised they would get a good one this time. The herbalist handed them the sleep charm, and they left his house. At midnight, Tobi quietly crawled out of his room, around 2:30 am to meet Segun, who had already sprinkled the sleep charm at the main door of the tenant's building. Segun had prepared everything and opened the door slightly for Tobi to come in. After much discussion, they had decided to take Mr. Brown's slippers. Mr. Brown, an engineer, was a newly married man who had moved into the house with his wife 4 months ago. He had a car, and everything seemed to be going well for him. Rumors even said that he had almost finished building a 4-bedroom flat in an expensive part of Lagos. His life appeared prosperous. They carefully took his slippers from their collection outside his room. The sleeping charm seemed to work, as none of the tenants woke up while they took the slippers. Tobi quickly ran back to his room, while Segun went to hide the slippers in an unfinished building near the house. He didn't want to risk being searched by the tenants in the morning. The next morning, something shocking happened. Mr. Brown searched for his slippers, but he couldn't find them anywhere. His wife screamed, calling out for the thief to show themselves. "Who took my husband's slippers?" she cried, but there was no answer. Mr. Brown was indifferent when he couldn't find his slippers. He simply shrugged and said, "Nothing bad will happen to me. Maybe I just misplaced my slippers." He didn't believe in superstitions, so he waved it off. Meanwhile, the 2 boys went to the herbalist's house. When they arrived, the herbalist called Segun inside to talk. Tobi sat outside, waiting for them. At first, he had a feeling that Segun might be hiding something from him, but he quickly dismissed it, thinking Segun would never betray him. After a while, Segun came out and told Tobi, "It's your turn now." "My turn for what?" Tobi asked, confused. Suddenly, Segun's voice became harsh. Go inside and do your own rituals. I've already done mine. Tobi walked in and saw the slippers burning. The herbalist spoke. You should thank your stars. You and your friend are now multimillionaires. Your friend just completed his rituals. Now it's time for yours. Tobi was overjoyed. What do I need to do, Baba? You have to sleep in that coffin. Meanwhile, Segun returned home about an hour after the pandemonium that followed the theft. He entered his room and came out with a few luggage boxes and bags, as though he had already packed them earlier. As he hurried toward the car parked outside, some of the tenants asked where he was going. But Segun didn't reply. He kept walking quickly until he ran into Mr. Fadar, the landlord, just as he was about to get into a small taxi. Hope there's no problem. Why are you packing up all of a sudden? Mr. Fadar asked. My mom is sick at home. She asked me to come immediately. Segun replied. With your bags too? Mr. Fadar asked, raising an eyebrow. EIM. Segun stammered, clearly uncomfortable. Don't worry, you can go, Mr. Fadar said, watching him closely as he got into the taxi. He thought, maybe he's done something terrible, and that's why he's running away. At least now, my son will be serious, since they're separated. Speaking of his son, Mr. Fadar hadn't seen Tobi all morning. I hope it's not what I'm thinking. I hope my boy hasn't followed Segun to his home. Worried, Mr. Fadar started looking for his son. The tenants, sensing his concern, reassured him. Calm down, sir. We all know Tobi. He's probably just walked down the street and is staying at a neighbor's house. Night came, and Tobi still hadn't returned. As Mr. Fadar was about to organize a search party to look for him, Tobi staggered in with blood on his hands and all over his mouth. He collapsed to the ground. His father and the others rushed him to the hospital. Tobi couldn't speak, and no one knew what had happened to him. The doctors ran several tests, but they couldn't find anything physically wrong with him. He was in obvious pain, but still, no one knew what was wrong. Mr. Fadar suspected that his son's condition had something to do with Segun, but since Tobi couldn't explain, he couldn't be sure. After no hospital would admit him, they took Tobi home. They called a pastor to pray for him and fasted for days, but nothing changed. Meanwhile, Segun had become a well-known Yahoo boy with many houses and cars. Girls surrounded him, and he was always the center of attention at popular clubs at night. His foreign clients paid him well, and he didn't even need to chat much with them before receiving his money. 3 years later, Mr. Brown, whose slippers had been stolen for the money ritual, had fallen into misery. Everything in his life had turned bad. One day, Mr. Brown, who had no job and was sinking deeper into debt, decided to visit his friend who owned a club. His friend had advised him to start a small business instead of looking for a job and promised to help with some money for capital. The club owner had been helping Mr. Brown through his hard times. As Mr. Brown entered the club, the guard recognized him and led him to see Mr. Joel. Mr. Joel gave him the promised money, and as they walked out of the office, Mr. Brown saw someone who looked familiar. He stopped in his tracks. He asked Mr. Joel, "Who is that guy? He seems to be the center of attention, spending money on all the girls in the club." Mr. Joel smiled and replied, "Oh, that's Shegsy, the hottest guy in the club. He's a very big Yahoo boy. When he comes to a club, the owner is guaranteed to make a lot of money." "Why do you ask? Do you know him?" Mr. Joel asked. "I know him well. His name is Segun. His school was near my house, and we lived in the same building. But we rarely spoke. We just greeted each other. He was a Yahoo boy, but he was struggling. He later dropped out of school. I even heard he was the one who made our landlord's son sick. So, seeing him here doesn't surprise me." The boys of today, just as Mr. Brown was about to leave, he and Segun made eye contact. Segun froze. He remembered the herbalist's warning. You must never set your eyes on the owner of the slippers you used again. Once you get home, pack all your things and leave before he sets his eyes on you. Feeling something strange, Segun suddenly began tearing his clothes and ran out of the club. Mr. Brown was left speechless, and everyone in the club was shocked. 2 weeks later, Segun's relatives drove him in an expensive car to Mr. Fader's building. The tenants, curious about the fancy car, came outside to see who was arriving. As they got out of the car, they recognized Segun, but he was scratching his body badly. The tenants were puzzled about why he was there all of a sudden. Segun kept shouting, "I will confess." The new tenants were told about Segun's past. Tobi wasn't around. He was at church, being prayed for. They called for the landlord, Mr. Fadar, who was with Tobi. When Mr. Fadar arrived, everyone gathered. Segun began his confession. "I was the one stealing the footwear at first, but one day, Tobi caught me stealing a pair of slippers. At that time, I wasn't yet using the sleeping charm. The crowd gasped in shock. He continued. Tobi was greedy. I had to convince him with just 3,000 naira. He begged me to teach him how I made money, but I wanted to keep all the wealth for myself. So, I worked with the herbalist to use him to increase my own riches. He had no idea that I planned to use him. The herbalist told us to find a pair of slippers from someone with a bright future, someone who is destined for success. We started using the sleeping charm, and we took many slippers, but the herbalist rejected most of them. Eventually, we stole Mr. Brown's slippers, and the herbalist accepted them.
Shoutouts to @AdaCantik7652 and @ENOCKSHUN-P9D, for being part of the people that commented on my last video. They found out where the stingy rich man was keeping his money. If you haven't watched it, go and do so after watching this. Want to get a shout out too? Comment where you are watching from in the comments section. You can also comment on what you think about the story. I am Tamil Deebs, and let's get back to the story.
Mr. Brown cried heavily while his wife rushed at Segun, nearly choking him in her anger. People quickly held her back, preventing her from killing him. Segun continued. I left the house quickly to avoid seeing Mr. Brown again, because the herbalist had warned me never to set my eyes on him. Tobi was kept in a coffin, all under the guise of making him rich, not knowing I was the one benefiting. So, when Mr. Brown came to the club that day, we saw each other, and now I'm feeling pain. People thought I was crazy, but I'm not. I don't want to go mad. But the herbalist said it would happen in 90 days. Segun started crying. Meanwhile, Tobi had been healed at the church, and he ran home, rejoicing. Finally, Mr. Brown, Tobi, and Mr. Fadar forgave Segun, and they all prayed for him. The person who had stolen the money Mr. Brown was accused of was caught and jailed. Mr. Brown was called back to his office, promoted, and received back all the money he had paid. Tobi learned his lesson, wrote another qualifying exam, and passed with flying colors. Mr. Fadar was so proud of his son. He later gained admission to the university. As for Segun, he went mad and became one of the most famous madmen in many cities. He always carried slippers in his hands as he roamed the streets. Here are 3 moral lessons from the story. 1. Greed leads to destruction. Both Segun and Tobi's greed for quick wealth led to their downfall. Instead of pursuing honest means, they resorted to deceit and rituals, which ultimately brought them pain, madness, and shame. The story emphasizes the dangers of prioritizing material wealth over integrity. 2. Every action has consequences. Segun and Tobi's actions affected not only themselves, but also innocent people like Mr. Brown, who suffered greatly due to their deeds. This shows that our choices, whether good or bad, have far-reaching effects on others, and we must act responsibly. 3. Forgiveness and redemption are powerful. Despite the pain caused, Mr. Brown, Mr. Fadar, and Tobi chose to forgive Segun, showing the importance of compassion and redemption. It highlights that while mistakes can have severe consequences, forgiveness and repentance pave the way for healing and change. The end. If you enjoyed the story, leave a comment and share your thoughts on what Segun did. Also, tell us where you are watching from. Please subscribe. Click the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And don't forget to like and share the video. See you in the next video.